Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 623. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about jagged mountains and up thrusts, ancient buildings and modern architecture, monasteries, and watchmaking as we talk about the UNESCO World Heritage Sites of Switzerland. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. With no further ado, let's talk about Switzerland. I'd like to welcome back to the show Gary Arndt, who has come this time to talk to us about the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Switzerland. Gary, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me for the 13th time.
We had to count up before we started this show how many times Gary has been on. If you don't know, there's a tag just for the episodes that Gary has done. So if you go to amateurtraveler.com/tag/Gary-Arndt, you'll see all the different episodes, lots of different places around the world. But you just came back from a trip to Switzerland.
Yeah, so I visited all of the World Heritage Sites in Switzerland, all 12 of them, and did it in a little under 2 weeks, so it was about one per day. And I got to see a lot of the country that I'd never been to before, that a lot of people don't visit before. To be honest, most of these places don't get a lot of tourism. And it was a really neat insight on the country and the different parts of it, because even though it's one country, there are really three major parts of the country, the German, French, and Italian parts. And even there are 4 official languages in Switzerland as well. And I also got to visit a city that speaks Romansh, which is the 4th language that's spoken by less than 1% of the population.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that small. I have not been to the Italian or Romansh speaking regions of the country yet.
Yeah, the Romansh isn't really a region per se, so much as it's particular kind of towns that speak it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but I think it's less than 1% of the population.
And both of those down in the southern portion of the country.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Well, why should someone go to Switzerland and see the UNESCO World Heritage Site?
They're extremely well done. everything in Switzerland just works. I mean, the thought I had when I was in Switzerland is that it's a European country that got upgraded to business class.
And it's sometimes with the same kind of cost that you go going to business class.
I'm not going to lie to you, it's expensive. And the Swiss franc when I was there was almost exactly on par with the US dollar. It was like
Yikes, okay.
0.995 Swiss francs to the dollar. And I remember the first night I was in Switzerland, I went to the hotel restaurant and there was a hamburger on the menu that was $28.
Yikes. Okay.
That being said, if you go to a grocery store or something like that and eat that way, it's not nearly so bad. And I ended up doing that quite a bit, which, quite frankly, is probably better for you in the long run anyhow.
Right. Well, it also tends to be if you eat more what the locals eat or at the local restaurant rather than the restaurant in the hotel, you can usually save some money.
The next evening, I went across the street to a pub, and it was about half the price.
Yeah, that's pretty typical. Excellent. Well, what kind of itinerary are you going to recommend to us?
So what we're going to do is start out in the northeastern part of the country and take a trip around clockwise. So we're going to be starting in the German-speaking regions, down to the Italian, back to the German, and then in the French. And it covers a lot of different parts of Switzerland. You have some natural areas. You have a lot of cultural areas. It really goes from the high Alps, where you have snow and glaciers, down to the parts of Switzerland where there are palm trees. And I bet you didn't know that they had palm trees.
I did not know that there were palm trees in Switzerland, at least outside of a hothouse. Interesting. Well, and when we talk about going all across Switzerland, I think I've driven halfway across in one day. It's not a huge country.
No. If you're in the southern part with the Alps, it can take some time to get from place to place just because of the Alps.
Right.
Trains have to go a little bit slower because you're in the mountains or going up and downhill. But I think you can get from, say, Zurich to Geneva in 2 hours by train.
Oh, wow. Okay.
If it's an express train. But yeah, I never really had a train anywhere that went more than an hour. I mean, I wasn't going across the whole country in one shot, but that was about the length of most of my trips. I wouldn't recommend, say, trying to explore the whole country out of Zurich and do day trips.
No, yeah.
But it's not huge, and it's not an insurmountable amount of distance. And I did it all by rail. And one of the things you might want to consider getting, just sort of as an overview, is a thing called the Swiss Pass. And it basically, you can get it in different lengths. I think there's like a 3-day, 8-day, whatever. Just search for Swiss Pass online. And not only does this give you free access to all the railways, but all the buses and hundreds of entrances for museums.
Oh, I didn't realize it to the museums also. Interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's a fantastic deal because, as we said before, Switzerland is not cheap. And the cost of the Swiss Pass can be recouped on your first train ride, depending on the train you're on. So it was really well worth it. And all I had to do was just show it to the conductor on the train. I just got on the train and that was that. And I even, like I said, I used it on a couple buses and I even used it to some of the World Heritage Sites we'll be talking about.
Excellent. So you started us in the northeast.
Yeah, so we're going to start with the city of St. Gall, or as it's known in German, St. Gallen. And the Abbey of St. Gall, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was put on the list in 1983. And St. Gall, or St. Gallen, was actually Irish. And he was a very early Christian monk who went into Europe. The abbey there, died there. And what it's best known for are two things. So the whole monastery compound is part of the World Heritage Site, but there are two notable things. One is the cathedral, which is a Baroque-style cathedral that has been renovated, and it is in just perfect shape. I mean, it is one of the best restored cathedrals I have ever seen, and really did a good job in terms of all the Baroque, for all the little touches and everything. And the cathedral is very nice, but the highlight, by far, of the Abbey of St. Gall is the library, which is one of the most comprehensive medieval libraries in the world. They have books dating back well over 500 years. It's not a huge library, but it's incredibly well preserved. The wood inside is fantastic. When you go there, you actually have these big slippers you have to put over your shoes so you don't scuff up the floor. And they have this fantastic old globe. Well, actually, it's not that old. Back before when Switzerland was first sort of forming, Zurich invaded St. Gall, And they
Okay.
took the globe, and now it's sitting back in Zurich. And there was always this bone of contention as to who should get it. And the way they ended up settling it was that Zurich could keep the original, but they had to reproduce an exact copy for the Abbey. And so that big globe, which is actually the height of a grown man, is sitting in the library today, and it's probably in better condition than the one in Zurich because it's a replica.
Hmm.
But interesting history, because the Abbey remained Catholic all throughout the Reformation, even though the rest of the town became Calvinist.
Hmm.
And so they ended up actually building a large wall around the Abbey, which was, I think both parties kind of wanted the wall
Okay.
because the town is Protestant, and
Hmm.
they didn't want them mingling with the monks and vice versa. And you can still see parts of it today, but today it's for the most part kind of a normal city. Very easy to get to. St. Gall's a reasonably sized city, very easy to get to by train. And this you probably actually could visit from Zurich on a day trip.
Okay.
So from there, we're going to go a little bit south to a natural site. And this is the Swiss Teutonic area of Sardona. And
Okay.
for most of the people that come here, it's just a nice place to go hiking up in the mountains.
Okay.
That's what most people probably think of it as. However, for geologists, and I actually got to go hiking with a geologist who was a guide, this is a really special place because it's the location of a thing called the Glarus Thrust. And it's one of the few places in the world where you have older rock on top of younger rock.
Okay.
And what happened is that there was a massive thrust of rock, this old rock that went on top of this really young rock. And there's a very definite zone you can see where the type of rock changes, and you had a very special type of stone, which kind of served almost as a lubricant, which is an odd thing to say because we're talking geologic times here. So it's
Right.
for most people, it's just a great place to go hiking. And one of the interesting things when we were on this hike is we could see all of Liechtenstein.
Oh, sure. You look like you're right there. Yeah.
Yeah, all of it. Like we were on this hill, it goes over there. I go, yeah, it's like there's Liechtenstein, all of it. You could just see there's like a bend in the river, another bend in the river, and that was it. We were out of Bad Ragaz, but there's several cities, Glarus being one of them, that are around this area. The World Heritage Site itself is up in the mountains, but there's a couple towns where you can actually access it by a ski lift. And that's actually what we did. We took a ski lift up to almost the top of this mountain. It was pretty high up. And then from there, we hiked even further. And we ended up, I think I had my Fitbit on, and it said I had climbed vertically the equivalent of 228 stories.
Ooh.
So I literally hiked up the Burj Khalifa that day and then down. And the down actually hurt my legs the next day more than going up.
Well, and you mentioned you were out of Bad Ragaz, and that would be a thermal bath town, if I guess correctly from the German name. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a spa there. And like I said, right next to Liechtenstein. You could go check that out. With the trains, you probably even could get there from a day trip from Zurich. It's actually not that far away. I think it was an hour and 15-minute train ride.
Okay.
To get there from Zurich. And there are several cities in the area. And again, everybody I saw there was Swiss. So it's not a place that I think is super well known outside of Switzerland. And I do believe, I came to this theory while I was hiking, that the number of hiking poles per capita in Switzerland is probably greater than any other country. I have no evidence, but I believe it to be true.
Okay. I think that is a supportable theory, if nothing else.
So the next one, we're going to go a little bit southeast. We're going to stay in the Alps. And this is the Radian Railway in Albula Bernina landscapes. Basically, this is a section of railway that passes through some extremely beautiful mountains. And it was put on the UNESCO World Heritage List primarily for the engineering that had to be done to create this railway. So there are a whole bunch of very impressive tunnels and very impressive bridges that you have to go through. So I actually took the Bernina Express, a full length of the World Heritage Path, and then I did most of the other route the next day on just kind of a regular train. And this technically on paper is shared with Italy, simply because the ending point of the Bernina Express actually is in Triano, Italy. So it's 99% Switzerland, 1% Italy. But I actually went down to Italy, had lunch there, and you do go through a little bit of Italian-speaking part near the border
Okay.
of Switzerland as well. It's not the main Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, but you will get to experience it. This is something that I think everybody could easily do if you're in Switzerland, because it's just a train trip.
Right.
If you're there in the summer, they usually have an open car as the last car. And I had a first class ticket, and my car was way up in the front. And I'm like, no. So one of the stops, I got out, ran all the way to the back. The conductor was like, well, you have a first class ticket. I'm like, I don't care. I want to sit in the back because the views are better. And it was an open air. And the nice part about that is, one, there are no windows. And two, when the train goes around a bend, you get to take a picture of the whole train because you're in the last car. But this is something I actually want to do in the winter, because the photos I've seen of this in the winter are just amazing, because it goes through some very high passes, and there was still some snow in the tops of some of the mountains when I was there, and that was in July.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, actually, it was on August 1st, the day I was there, which is the Swiss National Day. But in the winter, I think it would just be amazing. And a lot of the cities that are part of this World Heritage route are places that people may be familiar with because they're the high-end Swiss winter resorts like Davos and San Moritz.
Okay.
So I think it's something that would be great to do in the summer like I did, or even in the winter, assuming the train is operating. They have a Bernina Express that runs. That's the train I took, but they also have kind of like regular trains as well for people that want to go to Triano in Italy or wherever.
Excellent.
And you can use your Swiss pass on it. So that's another reason to use it. From there, then, let's go almost due east. This was in the Romanche community that I visited. This is the Benedictine convent of St. John's in Mouster. And Mouster is almost in the farthest easternmost point that you can get to in Switzerland. I've seen this in a couple places in Europe where the valley goes down into another country. So it's always easier to go into another country, even though it's technically in a different one. There's some places in Spain like this, Pyrenees, where the valley enters into France, but it's in Spain. Here, too, it actually is easier for these people to get to Italy. And the convent itself is actually like 100 meters from the Italian border. But the people there speak Romanche, which is, I guess, the closest language. I think it's the language which is closest to Latin.
To Latin of the time of the Romans. Yeah.
But probably very similar to Italian. But the Italian region that it enters into is South Tyrol, which is, they speak German. So go figure. Most of the people, everybody there speaks German as well, because they kind of have to. But in the day-to-day talking to each other, they'll speak Romanche. The convent is still a working convent. There are 11 nuns there. And while I was doing a tour, one of the nuns leaned out a window and said something. And they go, oh, that's Sister such and such. She's the new one. And I go, well, how old is she? She's 52. There's not a lot of young nuns. The reason why this is a World Heritage Site is basically due to the artwork in the main church. So you have all of this Carolingian artwork, which was there. The story is that the convent was started when Charlemagne was actually coming through this valley, and it rained and he sought shelter. And then when he left, and he said, we will start an abbey here. And so it was originally an abbey, then it became a convent, but it's still a working convent. There are 11 nuns there. They follow the order of St. Benedict, so they don't talk very much. And I actually got to talk to one of the nuns who spoke English, and she spoke to me, and she loves living there. She loves living in the convent. There are parts of the convent that you can't access because it is still a working convent, but most of it right now is converted to a museum, so you can walk around and see history of it. It used to also be the palace of the local bishop, Mouster, so that's all available.
Well, Carolingian, again, having to do with Charlemagne, and then the time frame would be late 700s, early 800s, roughly, in terms of when this would have gotten started. And the art would tend to be not very 3D yet.
Right. I'm not an art historian, but of the other World Heritage sites I've been to, it's more of like a Romanesque, so a pre-Renaissance.
Exactly.
It kind of looks cartoonish.
Right.
Best way I would describe it, not realistic. The church itself is not very big. It's not huge. It's actually smaller than when it was originally built because one of the wings was destroyed at one point and they just walled it up. Very nice place. And the community around it. I should also note Swiss National Park is in this area. And so the whole area around it is a national park as well. And again, there's a lot of people who, primarily Swiss people, who come here to go hiking and do other nature things.
Okay. A Swiss National Park seems like a very generic name for a national park in Switzerland.
Yeah. But I don't know, maybe they're first.
Well, that could be.
Now we're going to swing south and west to the town of Bellinzona.
The Swiss National Park was founded on August 1st, the national holiday of Switzerland. So in addition to being one of the earliest national parks in Europe, yes, it probably also has that because it was founded. Basically, for us, it'd be like the equivalent of founding a national park on July 4th. Interesting. Okay. So you were heading us somewhere else.
Yeah, down to Bellinzona, which is the capital of the canton of Ticino. And this is the Italian province, or the Italian canton, the one where Italian is the official language. And here, I had never been to the Italian part of Switzerland before. And this was really surprising because we have this notion of what Switzerland is, kind of this cartoonish notion of the chalets, the Alphorn, the Lederhosen, that kind of thing.
Lots of melted cheese.
That's German Switzerland.
Yeah.
And I was shocked at how the different parts of Switzerland, the different linguistic parts, are really different culturally. Because in Bellinzona, it felt like I was in Italy. I mean, not only was everything in Italian, obviously, but the architectural styles were very different. And I found this to be true also in the French parts as well. Because when we go back in time, all of these different bits of Switzerland joined at different times.
Right.
Joined the Confederation. And this used to be part of the Duchy of Milan. So it literally was Italian.
Okay.
It was part of what is today Italy. When I spoke about there being palm trees in Switzerland, so now we're kind of on the southern slope of the Alps.
Right.
Still a very mountainous area, but the climate's very, very different. This is the Lake Como region, and where you're going to see on the Italian side of the border, things like that. It's much warmer. Seldom gets below freezing in the winter. It can, but not the average temperature. I looked this up. We're above 0 Celsius, so above 32 Fahrenheit. And in Bellinzona, the World Heritage part of it is there are these 3 castles which are set up around the city, and it was a market town. And it's still kind of a market town. They have a farmer's market on Saturday that I got to actually check out. But what these 3 castles, when they're all very close to each other, they're walking distance easily if you like walking uphill.
Okay.
But basically, they were built so that at the time, the Duchy of Milan wanted to block this valley. So they had built the walls and then linking these 3 castles together, which were really fortifications. And then the Swiss ended up taking it and they extended the wall over a river. And then there was a flood in the river, which took down the wall, and they never rebuilt it. But basically, it's a old series of castles and walls. You can still see parts of the walls today, and they have a little, if you look very close on the ground, you'll be able to see a different colored brickwork going through the city, which is where the old city wall used to be. And I actually shouldn't call it, there was a city wall, but this wall was not actually surrounding the city. It was just a linear wall to block the valley off. And it was a way to raise money.
Taxes, sure.
Right, because it was a very important trade route going through the Alps, which is why it was so important. And one of the major thoroughfares from the German-speaking regions to the north of the Alps and the Italian-speaking regions to the south of the Alps.
Interesting.
But just as an aside, I really liked this area a lot, and I knew very little about it.
It's gorgeous, and I feel like I've never seen pictures of it even.
Because I think, again, when people have this notion of Switzerland, they're going to the Alps, and they have this idea of what it is, and this doesn't meet that same stereotype. But it's very similar to what you're going to see in northern Italy in terms of that Lake Como area, which now that I was there, I'm realizing, well, I've never really spent a lot of time in northern Italy. So that's something, in the future, I'm definitely want to do.
Well, and you mentioned the Lake Como area a couple of times. That and the Dolomites in northern Italy are just fantastically beautiful places. We've talked about them elsewhere in this show, so we won't go into detail now, but definitely someplace that I would recommend.
And very close to Bellinzona, basically, I went there from a day trip, is Mont San Gregorio.
Okay.
I hope I got that right. And this is a natural site. Basically, it's a paleontology site. They found lots and lots of fossils here. This used to be a seabed, so they've discovered tons. As far as visiting the site, it can be a bit challenging. They have a pretty good museum, and you can visit the museum. There's nothing in English, fair warning.
Mm-hmm.
I think they have audio guides that are available in English, but everything is either in Italian or German. And actually visiting the mountain itself, there are some places you can go. And this is a problem with every paleontology site that I've ever been to that's a World Heritage Site.
Uh-huh.
The things that make it special and interesting have all been taken out of the ground. Or they're still in the ground, but you can't see them because they're in the ground. So it's very tough. This is true in sites in Indonesia I've been to, in Germany, in other places as well. So they're always a very tough visit. And usually the museum is going to be your best bet from a visitation standpoint.
Right.
But I would highly recommend this whole region of the South Ticino region. Loved it, and absolutely am going to be going back there at some point.
Well, and I'm not sure exactly how to say it, but I think you had an extra R in there. I'm seeing Mount San Giorgio.
Giorgio, yeah, we'll go with that. I think that sounds right.
And I'm making that up, so.
It's a fantastic area.
Mm-hmm.
The World Heritage Site is interesting. I think this is one of the sites that you kind of go to if you're just sort of a World Heritage enthusiast like I am.
Collector, yeah.
Or you're really into paleontology.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing the vast majority of people that visit the museum are going to be kids on school trips.
Okay, sure.
So a lot of these places we've talked about so far don't necessarily get a lot of foreign tourists.
Mm-hmm.
The next one we're going to talk about gets all the foreign tourists, and that's Jungfrau.
Mm-hmm.
I was really shocked when I was going there because I didn't know. I mean, I'd never really heard of Jungfrau, although I guess in hindsight I've seen photos and a lot of other things.
Mm-hmm.
The Lautenbrunnen Valley, which this is standing over, is incredible. I mean, I think it's like Yosemite Valley. I mean, it's an incredibly deep alpine valley. And next time I go to Switzerland, I am going to this place, really not to go up into the mountains again in Jungfrau, but to visit this valley. And the valley's not part of the World Heritage Site, but boy, is it beautiful. I mean, it's just fascinating. And I want to go visit a lot of the little villages, not only in the valley floor, but up on top of the valley. But Jungfrau itself is a mountain. And in the early 20th century, this guy had a bright idea of building a tunnel
Mm-hmm.
through the mountain up to the top of the mountain. That was his idea. So we're going to bore a tunnel that's going to go in the mountain up, not through it like most tunnels do, because they want to go from A to B and there happens to be a mountain in the way.
Right.
He wanted to go take a train to the top of the mountain. So they spent, I think, like 16 years. This is before World War I, primarily with Italian laborers, building this 7-kilometer tunnel. And up at the top, they have a place called the Top of Europe. And there's a glacier up there. The views are absolutely gorgeous. And I'm pretty sure a very large percentage of everyone in the nation of China was there.
Okay.
Just hundreds and hundreds of Chinese tourists on package tours all go to Jungfrau. And I got to hand it to the Jungfrau is actually also a company. So they run the Top of Europe place where you go visit.
Mm-hmm.
And from a marketing standpoint, I was so impressed by what they did. There are 3 restaurants in the Top of Europe. And there's a Chinese restaurant, an Indian restaurant, and a Swiss restaurant. To give you an idea of, they invited a famous Indian cricket player to come and play cricket on the glacier.
Okay.
Chinese pop stars, Chinese actresses, Bollywood actresses. The Switch Watch Company has a shop way, way up at the top where people can buy watches. Now, if you've traveled enough, you know, don't ever buy things
right
at these tourist places, right? There are probably like 2 or 3 sales, and these are not cheap watches, right?
No, right.
This is in the multiple hundreds of dollars to thousands of dollars while I was sitting there. And all of the people that worked at the watch store spoke Chinese. So to give you an idea. But then when you're up there, you could go sledding. They had things you could buy. They had a zip line. They had a golf tee. So you could actually get up the driver and hit golf balls on the glacier. So, like I said, I was just so impressed with the marketing that was behind this because they did a masterful job. And Lindt, the chocolate company,
Hmm.
has a chocolate store up there and a little tiny museum where the history of chocolate and all these other things. Again, just a really fantastic job marketing, but it is a tourist trap. But if you want to actually visit the Jungfrau Mountain, it's really kind of the only way to do it. And it's one of those things that I wouldn't say don't do it. It's kind of like visiting the pyramids or a lot of other
Hmm.
places,
Sure.
or Venice, that are very popular. It's cool, but I think the train ride up is one of the most impressive things. And then once you're there, the view is fantastic. It's very pretty, but it is highly marketed.
Well, the one thing I would say about this, tried to get there before, and we went there in, I want to say it was June, and unfortunately the weather didn't cooperate, and it's one of those things where we only had one day in our schedule, and there are a number of places like that where if you had 2 days built in, you would probably more than double your chance of being able to actually get up there and see something. But it was socked in with rain the day we were there, and I don't even think it was running. The train wasn't. We stayed in Grindelwald. We explored Interlaken and the two lakes around there and some of the castles in that region, but never got up to the Jungfrau.
But yeah, it is an absolutely beautiful area. The
Hmm.
valley that it overlooks is really stunning. And like I said, the Lautenbrunnen Valley is really on a par with Yosemite Valley,
Hmm.
except there are farms in it and it's not a park. I was really, really impressed with it. It is absolutely gorgeous. Technically, this is in the canton of Bern.
Oh, really? Okay.
I should say it. I think the actual top of Europe part is in a different canton, but everything leading up to it, all the villages below, are all in Bern.
Hmm.
So you could actually come here from a day trip from Bern, which leads us to the next World Heritage Site, which is the city of Bern. A lot of city centers in Europe, major cities, so Paris, Budapest, Rome, are all just a World Heritage Site. They kind of just lump the whole thing together. The only example of that really in Switzerland is the old city of Bern. And Bern was built on a peninsula insofar as there's a river that does a horseshoe bend. So you have this peninsula shaped hunk of land that was a really great fortification, which is why the city was there.
Sure.
And so you have the Munster, which is the cathedral, which eventually became a Protestant cathedral, not a cathedral, it's the Munster, during the Reformation. And the clock tower in town is the most famous part of the city. And it is still functioning. I think it was 800 years old. And I actually got to go in the tower and see it working.
Hmm.
And it's still all the original gears and everything else. It's cared for, and they put grease on the wheels and everything. And they have ropes to make sure everything works. And it still functions. It's gravity fed, so they have to wind it up every single day. Somebody goes up there to do it. And then on the hour, there will be things that happen. And the interesting thing is the clock is actually a little bit off from the actual time for two reasons. One, while I was there in the summer, so the clock does not observe daylight savings
Okay.
because that's a rather recent invention.
Sure. Yeah.
And two, it uses the time for Bern, the solar noon. So before we had time zones, every city would have its
Right.
own noon,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Because they determined it from when the sun was at the zenith.
Really, before you had railroads, you didn't need to do calculations so much. You just looked at what time noon was. Yeah.
Right. So it keeps noon for Bern,
Hmm.
like it would have been before the time zones. And the Central Europe, I think it's called the Central Europe time zone, is huge. So it encompasses Spain, I think, all the way to Poland. It's a really big swath of land. So I think it's actually off by maybe 15, 20 minutes or something like that from when the time normally is. So that's just kind of an interesting thing that they chose to keep it to its local traditional time rather than sync it up to modern timekeeping methods.
Hmm. Well, and you mentioned clocks and watches and Reformation, and one little tidbit here is that a lot of the heritage that we think of Swiss watches and the clocks and things like that is actually happened during the Reformation when French Huguenots came over and were welcomed by the Swiss Protestants and brought with them that technology, basically that skill. And so a lot of that traces back to that same time period.
Well, that's an excellent segue to our next World Heritage Site.
All right.
Which is the town of Le Chaux-de-Fonds.
Oh, the watchmaking town. Okay, sure.
Yes. And so I'll be very honest. I didn't know a lot about this town. And I thought this would be the least impressive World Heritage Site on this trip. Turned out to be the most interesting of all the ones I went to. Because I just knew generally that Switzerland was known for watches.
Right.
Just in general, right? Just like they're known for chocolate and cuckoo clocks. That's all.
Right. Well, cuckoo clocks are German, yeah.
But there's a great line from The Third Man. I don't know if you've ever seen it, about Switzerland having 400 years of peace and prosperity, and all they developed was the cuckoo clock. But so the town of Le Chaux-de-Fonds, actually, so it's in the mountains, but it's not in the Alps.
Okay.
So you don't really notice that you're that high, but it's actually one of the highest cities in Europe.
Huh.
But you wouldn't know it. So it actually gets quite cold in the winters. And the reason why it's a World Heritage Site has to do with the town planning. And a lot of people say it looks like an American laid out city in that it's in grids.
Okay.
They go through pains to tell you, no, it was not based on an American city, which is true. It was simply a planned city. And watchmaking at that time, Karl Marx actually talked about Le Chaux-de-Fonds about it being an industrial city, but it's not a heavy industry. It's a light industry.
Mm-hmm.
And most of it was done by people in their homes. So they didn't go to the watch factory. They just had a small little workshop in their home. And the limiting factor was daylight. They had to have very good light for doing this because the pieces they dealt with were so small.
Huh.
So all of the homes were designed, these buildings, to maximize sunlight.
Huh.
And they're built in this grid up a hill. So basically everyone would be able to put their workshops facing a particular side of the building and maximize the amount of light. And so when you're there, it's very clear how this works. And you can see the buildings, and they're all laid out in a grid. And I should also note that laying things out in a grid is not necessarily an American thing. It's a planned thing.
Right.
So most of the major towns in Europe were never planned. They just happened. Alexandria, Egypt, for example, was a planned city by Alexander the Great. And as a result, they had very logical streets because it was a city planned from the get-go. So that's why it is how it is. But the interesting thing was not the town planning, which is the UNESCO part. The interesting thing is I did not realize almost every single company that makes high-end watches is in this town. And I was there for 2 days. The first day we go and we're driving around, and I see buildings for every watch company, all of them. Rolex, Cartier, Patek Philippe, Tissot, Tag Heuer, all of these companies that you normally just know from airport billboard ads.
Yes,
you know
okay.
what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do.
And then so many other companies that I'd never even heard of that I ended up researching them that night. And I just started even Rolex. Technically, their headquarters is in Geneva, but all the actual watches are built in either Le Chaux-de-Fonds or the community right next door to it of La Local. Okay. I know I butchered it.
Sounded good the first time.
So they're very close to each other. In between the two cities are where all the modern watches are currently built.
Okay.
There are no outlet stores because I asked. So you can't go in to pick up a cheap watch. It's all sold retail. There's a museum in each of the communities. And they're very, very different from each other. But I would recommend going to both of them. The one in Le Chaux-de-Fonds is quite a big museum, and it really talks about the history of time. And they do have examples from most of the major companies that are in town, as well as all sorts of timekeeping devices, getting into everything, including water clocks from ancient Egypt to atomic clocks and the GPS system today. It's a very fascinating museum. And I was there for maybe a little over an hour, 90 minutes, and I probably could have doubled my time there because it was so interesting. And watches are something that we're all familiar with, but I never really thought about how they came about, how they were developed. Like I didn't know watches initially were all pocket watches.
Right. Sure.
And I think most people probably knew that that was the style. And it was simply a larger case that the components that you were using didn't need to be so super small. And wristwatches were originally simply designed for women. They were called a bracelet.
I did not know that. Okay.
Yes. And so men did not wear wristwatches, and they did not start wearing wristwatches until the beginning of the 20th century, and in particular in World War I, when they needed quick access to a timepiece to synchronize military movements.
Huh.
And that's how the wristwatch developed. And also, the fact that men have a larger wrist means that the face of a man's wristwatch can be a little bit bigger
Sure.
than a woman's, which means that it's also probably a little bit easier to design. But yeah, I was not aware of that. But in the museum, I got to see they had an example of the world's thinnest watch. And then I'm talking mechanical watches here for
Right.
everything, electric watches, which was like 1 or 2 millimeters thick.
Oh, wow.
Smallest mechanical watch they had in the museum, which you could barely see. It was like the size of an aspirin or something like that.
Huh.
I was just really fascinated by it. And I even got to go to this one place where I won't say you get to build a watch, but you get to take a tweezers and put a cogwheel on and a spring and everything like that. And I screwed it up. But you got to see the spring mechanism is very, very delicate. I don't think people realize just how delicate they are. In fact, there's a special company that makes the springs for all of the other watch companies, I think with one exception. I think Rolex may do their own. But otherwise, everyone else outsources it because it's such a specialized thing. The metal is so thin and so light.
Right. And it has to be very controlled in terms of how it expands.
Got this little kit, and you put everything together, and then they have a little device where the clock runs. It's like an oscilloscope, not quite an oscilloscope, but you can tell by the pattern that it shows you if the watch is off, if it's not balanced correctly. And of course, mine wasn't. But you can appreciate intellectually the skill of making a watch.
Right.
But until you actually have to do it yourself, you have much more appreciation. The other amazing thing is everybody I talk to in that town either is or has a very close relative, husband, wife, brother, sister, father, whatever, in the watchmaking business. Either they are watchmakers or they're involved in some other aspect of it, like working for a watch company in accounting or marketing, or they work for one of the many other companies that provide services to the watch companies. So just walking around, I saw this one company and it looked like a very small firm that had diamond saws. So it was really fascinating because I just didn't know much about this, and it was a great excuse to go there and learn about it. And I never really thought about it. I just sort of assumed Swiss watches came from Zurich or some German-speaking part. I didn't realize it was all in the French part. I should say Le Chaux de Fonds is right over the French border.
Right.
Like
I was going to mention that.
Kilometers away. And a lot of the employees are actually French. Because the Swiss franc is so strong, it's cheaper for them to hire people from the EU, believe it or not.
Okay. That makes sense.
France is their Mexico.
Okay.
So there are two serial sites. And serial sites are basically when they have locations in multiple countries, different sites located all over.
Right.
And there are two of them that Switzerland shares with other countries. And one of them is the pile dwellings of the Alps. And on the banks of Lake Neuchâtel, in the canton of Neuchâtel, which also includes Le Chaux de Fonds, there are, I think, 101 different sites under this World Heritage Site. So 101 different locations, of which 52 are in Switzerland. And most of those are not places you can visit. It's just a place that may not even have a sign. And so if you didn't know about it, you wouldn't know it's there. And I was talking to one of the curators at the museum. So the place I did go was called Latium, Latenium. It's on the banks of Lake Neuchâtel. And it is a location of one of these pile dwellings, which is basically, they're like stilt homes that can be found on lakes, all sort of through the Alps.
One word you left out here, too, is prehistoric pile dwellings.
These date back to, I want to say, the Pleistocene, the last ice age, when water levels were very, very different. And the piles are actually really long. They have one of them in this museum, in the Lantium Museum. And Lantium actually is named after a period of time. There's a time period. And they have some excellently preserved basket weavings in this museum. And other organic material, which really struck me as interesting because you don't normally see things like that are preserved because they're organic. We have bones, we have stone tools, we have things like that, but you don't see organic things. And this museum had it. It's a really good museum. Like I mentioned with going to paleontology sites, archaeologic sites are sometimes the same way. Sometimes there is something you can see if there's a building that was excavated. But in this case of the pile dwelling sites, there's a site I went to in Germany. There's one in Italy. So even though there's 101 locations on paper that are protected, there's really a few places for tourism purposes if you wanted to go visit to actually kind of see it. And this is probably the best one. So it's in the city of Neuchâtel. It's called Lantium, and definitely the place you would want to visit.
I'm seeing that they're actually from Neolithic and Bronze Age, so just a little later than you were saying. So it would be after the last ice age, starting about 10,000 BC. So a long time ago.
Yeah. Then we're going to go a little bit south to our last two, which are very close to each other. We're going to the town of Vevey, which is on Lake Leman. This is, just as a side trivia note, this is where Charlie Chaplin moved.
Oh.
When he got booted out of the U.S. in the 1950s, he lived here the rest of his life. You can visit the Charlie Chaplin Museum, which is his home, which I did. Actually, a really nice museum. Surprising. There are some creepy statues of Charlie Chaplin they have in the house. But other than that, and it gets a surprisingly large number of visitors every year, too, which I didn't expect because I think a lot of people know who Charlie Chaplin is, but not necessarily they're watching a lot of silent Charlie Chaplin movies anymore. And Vevey is also the headquarters of Nestle, which I did not know.
Okay.
So I learned that. So there are two World Heritage sites right next to here. The major one is Lavaux, which is the area right next to it, which is a wine growing region. So on the banks of the lake is very steep hillsides. And this is the main Swiss wine growing region. So you probably haven't heard of Swiss wines.
Not so much.
Exactly. And there's a reason for that. It's because they export almost none of it. Almost all of it. And then I talked to several people about this. It's all consumed within Switzerland. And it's simply due to the fact that for export reasons and also for currency exchange reasons, it's just easier to sell it domestically than it is to sell it overseas. And this Lavaux region on the banks of Lake Leman. So the lake is split between Switzerland and France. And because Switzerland is on the north side of the lake, the terraces here are getting all the sunlight. So they do grow some grapes on the French side, but it's not as conducive to it. And really, it's just a very nice place to kind of drive around. The terraces are very nice. I think someone on one of the World Heritage sites I belong to said there are currently 24 World Heritage sites that deal with wine in some manner.
Okay.
So there's a lot of them. So I got to actually visit one of the wineries, and they're all, for the most part, pretty small, not kind of industrial scale. There's a place called Vinorama. So there's Highway 9, which is the main highway that goes along the lake. And this Vinorama place, you cannot miss it. And most of the local winemakers will have their bottles of wine there where you can actually go and buy some Swiss wine if you want. Because like I said, otherwise it's very hard to find in your local wine store because they just don't export it. And just as kind of an aside, some of the best wines I've had all over the world are wines that you cannot find because they don't export it.
Sure.
In the Basque region of Spain, I had a white wine called Chocolate, spelled with an X and an O. It's a Basque thing. But I had never heard of it before. And you don't see it in stores. And I remember I was at some high-end hotel, and there was a sommelier, and I thought I'd be very clever, and I thought I'd quiz him on it. And I would say, do you have any chocolate? And without skipping a beat, he knew what it was. And he said, well, no, it's not something which is usually available for export, and we don't currently have it in our cellar. But if you really, really want some, I'm sure we could arrange it, and, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, they don't sell a lot of this. And I can't off the top of my head tell you some of the grape varietals, but I remember looking at a list, and it's several varietals you don't really see anywhere else. Mostly white wines that are produced because it is pretty far north and still at an altitude, but some reds as well. And was able to do a tasting, sat down for like 2 hours and had some, and quite good.
Well, and you mentioned that this is on Lake Lemán, and people may or may not be familiar with that lake, but the end of the lake is Geneva. So we're really only about an hour from Geneva by car at this point.
Yeah, it's not far away. I think some of the people even mentioned that they commute to Geneva by train. So
okay.
Montreux is also very close by. Oh, and I should also add, so if you're listening to this and you're a big wine fan, the Lavaux region has a wine festival that is held once every 20 years.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
And it will be held in 2019.
Huh.
So it's something that if you're really into wine, you might want to consider visiting. So it'll be held, I believe, in late July and August of 2019. So people are getting ready for it. And I asked them, I was like, well, why do you do it every 20 years? Why not every 10 years? Or that's the tradition. That's what they do.
I'm reading in terms of varietals that they have 30 different varieties. So the most famous ones that we would be familiar with would be Gewürztraminer, which again, a German Rhine wine, Pinot Gris. And then they do have some in Switzerland. The most popular wines are Pinot Noir, Gamay, Gamay, and Gara Noir, which I don't even know.
Yeah, so the Gamay I'd never really heard of before, and there's also some other...
That one I've had, but the last two I don't know.
Oh, I remember one of them because it's Plant Robert.
Okay, yeah.
Which in French is the robber plant, because it was actually someone, I think they stole it from an abbey in France and they brought it to Switzerland. But when you see it in English, it's Plant Robert.
Right.
And someone actually and this is the name of the varietal, right? Mm-hmm. And I was asking him about this because the first thing you think of course, is Robert Plant, lead singer of Led Zeppelin. Okay. And they gave him a bottle of Plant Robert. And his first reaction was he was kind of irked, like they were stealing his name or something like that. And they go, no, this is in French, and it's been around since before you were born. And then he kind of warmed up to the idea, and he loved the fact that there was a wine basically with his name. So
that's funny. And you have one more?
And this is just outside of the city of Vevey. And this is another cereal site. And these are the architectural works of Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was an architect in the early 20th century. Ironically enough, he was born and grew up in Les Chaux-de-Fonds, the watchmaking town. And some of his early buildings are there, but none of those buildings are inscribed on the World Heritage List. He really kind of got fed up with Switzerland, left to go to France, lived there the rest of his life, but his parents still lived in Switzerland. And the Le Corbusier sites are scattered all over the globe. A bunch of them are in France. There's one that I saw, I won't say I visited it, in Antwerp, because it's in private hands. Most of the sites are in the Le Corbusier Foundation control, including this one, Villa Le Lac, which is right on Lake Lemán. And this was a house that he built for his mother. And she lived there, I think, until 1962. She died at the age of 100. And it's a very small house. It's not very big, not big at all. And I think his brother lived there with his mother, and then after she passed away for a bit, and it's now in the control of the foundation. But it's on a great location right next to the lake. The neighbors originally hated it because it didn't blend in with anything else. Now, of course, it's a World Heritage Site and everybody loves it. It's easy to find in that it's on that main highway right out of the city. But the parking, because it's like between the lake and a hill, is very difficult. So thankfully, it's not that popular of an attraction, but you may have to park like a block or so away just because parking is rather scarce. A proper visit really doesn't have to take that long. Like I said, it's not very big. And the primary interesting elements of it are all architectural, just some of the innovations he did in terms of the windows and everything else. They have restored the building to the best that they can to what they believe to be the original colors and the original design, like in the courtyard, which is also not very big. A lot of the Le Corbusier buildings were thought to all be white, and everyone thought that was his signature. And then they did some digging around because they had black and white photos. And what they didn't realize is that most of his buildings were actually a pastel color. And when they went digging around below the paint, they saw light greens, light yellows, things like that, which would appear to be white in a black and white film or black and white photo. And so they've been changing the color in a lot of these buildings to what the original color was. And they did that here as well. But it's one of these things that if you're in the area, or if you're a big fan of architecture, or if you're trying to visit all these World Heritage sites, it's a neat place to visit. I don't think a visit would need to take more than 30 minutes. Easily see anything. And you can probably get I won't say a guided tour, but they certainly have people on site that will help explain everything. There is an entrance fee. I don't know if the Swiss Pass covers this because it's a private foundation.
Well, and just to put him on a timeline, so this is modernism, I think is the right term, and it's just before World War I. Basically, is when he starts his architectural.
That's when he starts.
Yeah,
right. So if you go to Le Chaux de Fonds and go to see the watchmaking site, you can see the very earliest Le Corbusier sites, one that he originally built for his parents. And they're architecturally different. I don't think he had come into his own at the time, which is why they're not listed, I think, on the World Heritage list.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
When they do these serial sites, what I've noticed in several other locations is that they tend to go overboard when they initially do their submission. Like the farmhouses of Hälsingland in Sweden that I visited last year, they initially put 700 different sites on the list. And they came back and they're like, this is way too many. So they cut it down to 7. But there's 693 other sites that are basically the same.
Right.
And I think the same is true here. So again, as an aside, if we have American listeners, I think in 2019 or 2020, they're going to resubmit the Frank Lloyd Wright sites. And there too, they had to pick and choose, well, what sites are we going to put on the list? Because he designed a whole bunch of things. And they picked, it's kind of the greatest hits. Falling Water, the Guggenheim,
right.
Taliesin, I think the Robbie House in Chicago. What's the one in San Francisco? Is it a Unitarian church?
Or, I don't know. Okay.
I think there's one in Tokyo as well, mostly American. But yeah, they kind of have to pick and choose. But there are other Le Corbusier sites. There's one in Argentina that I've not been to, the National Museum in Japan.
The UN headquarters in New York City. So that's probably the best known one that he designed from what I'm seeing.
But not part of the World Heritage Site.
Yes. Right. Yeah, and if you look at more of his later work, you can see how it would relate to the Bauhaus movement out of Germany in between the war.
It's similar, but a little different.
Yes. Related to was as far as I was willing to go.
Yeah, there's a couple other, the Rietveld Schroeder House in Utrecht. I thought was very similar in design to Villa Lalac that I visited. Also another very small house, and a lot of just architectural things in terms of sliding walls and ways to maximize space, maximize the appearance of being very open and airy, while the sliding doors, you can create rooms or open them up as you see fit. So those are the World Heritage Sites in Switzerland. And I should also add, I don't think Switzerland has any sites on their tentative list.
Oh,
so they basically, they have these sites and they were like, yeah, we're good. As opposed to Italy or Germany, which just wants to slap another one up every single year.
Well, and this show is going long, so we're going to wrap it up here. But last 2 questions for you. Of all the sites you went to, you're standing at the prettiest one. Where are you standing and what are you looking at? Oh,
you're probably, in terms of just sheer beauty, you're probably in Jungfrau.
Okay.
Either that or you're hiking in the Sardona parts of the Alps. This is actually the first time I had kind of been in the Alps, but not like this before. And the Alps are not as high as the Rocky Mountains or the Himalayas or a lot of other places. What makes the Alps so special is the drama, right? You have these...
Like the Matterhorn, which is just...
Yeah. I mean, it's all up and down. And I would say the closest example might be the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, not the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. They're very different. The Rocky Mountains in Alberta are not as tall,
Mm-hmm.
but they're much more dramatic, meaning you're going to take much nicer photos there. And the same is true, I think, with the Alps.
Or I think of the Tetons in the U.S.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Same way.
Yep.
And I would say another close runner-up in the cultural category would have to be the library in the Abbey of St. Gall.
Okay.
Absolutely beautiful. And the one thing that I really wish I could have done, but I can't because they don't allow it, you cannot take pictures inside the library.
That always is hard.
Yeah. So I'm going to have to use a stock image or something for my website, but I really wish I could have taken photos.
Well, and in case you haven't been listening to the other 12 shows we've done with Gary, Gary is widely known for his photography. So we'll put links over to his website where you can read more about his trip. But also, if you're there, please take a look at the photography, which I think you will love. Gary, thanks so much for coming back on Amateur Traveler. I look forward to having you back on the 14th time.
I look to being here on the 14th time. Thanks for having me.
In news of the community, I heard from Anne about the recent episode we did on Sumatra. Hi, Chris. Love your show, and especially the Sumatra episode. I went about 5 years ago and had a fabulous time diving at Pulau Way, all the way up on the north tip. It took something like 25 hours to get there from Medan, with not one but 2 flat tires and a passenger count of 28 in a 12-seater minibus, but was well worth the effort. And, yes, the minibuses in the developing world can be very interesting. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. Remember, we still have that Africa trip coming up in May of 2019. AmateurTraveler.com/Africa 2019 to get more information about that. If you have any questions, send an email to host@AmateurTraveler.com, or if you'd like to sponsor the show, leave a comment on this episode at AmateurTraveler.com, and thanks so much for listening.